Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today, we have Tyler Roberts on the show again today. How's it going?
Doing great, sir. How are you?
Doing good. Doing good. Looking forward to this. So, in this episode, we're talking about password spraying. And password spraying, as many of you know or listening, it's a favorite technique among attackers who are trying to compromise organizations in a targeted way and kind of a spray and pray kind of way, kind of an opportunistic way. So Tyler and I are going to dig into external password spraying. We're going to talk about internal password spraying. Those are kind of two of our area of specialties. Tyler's specialties external, and I'm on the internal. We're going to talk about why it's effective, how password spraying works, and what to look out for on your network, and hopefully arm you with some ideas or some takeaways in terms of what to expect when somebody is performing a password spray, whether it's an attacker or a pen tester, how to detect it, how to defend against it, some of the mitigations you can have in place, and all those wonderful things. So without further ado, Tyler, what's password spraying? Just kind of lay it out for us, and then we'll get into the external side of things, what we do, why we do it, how we do it, what an attacker might look like when they do it, that kind of thing.
Right. So password spraying specifically is when you're taking one password and you're using it against a large number of accounts. Typically, password spraying is limited in the number of attempts you send. That's why it differs from brute forcing. And your goal is just to spray that password and try and pop it on an account. Typically, when we see attackers do password sprays, you're not trying to lock out accounts. So it's one of those low and slow kind of things. But, there are a lot of attempts that all come from the same IP, which is a giveaway for password spraying.
Yeah. So what are some of the reasons why attackers might password spray, right? When we think about external attack surface, right? What are some of the reasons why an attacker might password spray? What are some of their targets they would be focusing on?
Yeah, so external password spraying is, really where people are going to look for initial footholds. So some common things that we do before we password spray is OSINT, and sometimes you can find like company passwords that you set up accounts with, and you might want to password spray for that that account, or you can find a common scheme of their password policy. And you can make passwords and spray based off that, things of that nature.
Yeah, and one of the common ways that we do it when we're pen testing, right, is we will do the OSINT process like Tyler was talking about. We will scrape words from the organization's website that we're pen testing against, right? We'll look at geographic landmarks, right? We'll look at demographic information of the people who work at that organization using things like LinkedIn, stuff like that. So we'll build kind of a target package, if you will, of potential words, passwords that employees might use. And then we'll put those into a word list. We'll add, years and numbers and special characters at the end, right, Tyler?
Yep.
And make a password list that we will then use to kind of spray against all the accounts that we can find.
Yeah, so think excluding like the special passwords that we make for organizations. We do have a running list that we use on every engagement. It's about 60 or 70 passwords long. That's just the most common passwords that we've seen cracked on engagements that we've ran, and just some of the worst passwords that still pass password policies if you're not using those fine-grained policies that prevent them. But, that's kind of a list that we've built out and we've learned, and that's very effective, that we use outside of those special passwords you were talking about.
I want to talk about what we want to password spray, or what an attacker would want to password spray. Before we do that, maybe just a sidebar. What are some of the most common passwords you've seen that have gotten you access to an account, barring any specific company names or anything like that?
So I think there was one engagement. I did not do it. It was Sam, and it was an engagement he was doing, and he ended up cracking 5 different accounts with the same password. So it was fall 2023 exclamation point. And yeah, I think that was a pretty, rough meeting. I'm not exactly sure where the lapse of judgment went in there. But yeah, 5 different accounts, all with the same password on that engagement. So that was the initial foothold for him there.
Yeah, and at the end of the episode, we're going to talk about mitigations and detection, stuff like that. And there are ways to prevent against those kinds of things, both technical controls and administrative controls that you can put into place. So if you're an IT admin or a security leader, a CISO, sysadmin, or something like that, and you're listening to this episode, listen to the end or jump to the end if you're listening to the recording, which you can have the luxury of doing. And go to the mitigation section where we talk about those things.
Right. It's not really, I wouldn't say executive's fault that users are choosing those passwords, because technically those are going to pass password requirements. They're long enough, they have that special character, and they have a number in them. So they're passing 3 out of those 4. It's just without implementing fine-grained policies, how do you really prevent that?
Yeah. And, users will get creative sometimes, and instead of summer 2024 ! They'll do summertime, right?
Mhm.
So it avoids, if you have a banned password list and you can't use summer year special character, it kind of gets away. It kind of gets you by that, bypasses it, right?
Right.
And there's other creative ways that I've seen on engagements where users have used a weak password but kind of mutated it slightly so it didn't trigger or it didn't get blocked by the banned password lists that organizations set up. So those are the kind of fringe cases that is great, because us as pen testers, right, we try to test for those things. So we think, okay, what are some of the common passwords users going to use, and what are kind of the edge cases of those where they might kind of bypass those filters and things like that. So what are we targeting, right? Whether it's a pen test, whether it's an attacker, what are we actually targeting as our focus for an external password spray?
So my number 1 and number 2 resources are going to be whoever you're using for mail is going to be my primary resource, because that's going to be the service that the most accounts of your organization have access to, because everybody at your organization is going to have a mail account in some way or fashion. So whether that be Microsoft or that be Gmail, one of the suites is getting targeted for that password spray would be the number 1 resource. The second thing I'm looking for, since I don't want to spray another service that's linked to Microsoft, I'm going to look for services such as Zoom that might have their own login that's not, federated back to Microsoft, so that I can be submitting additional attempts via a different, SaaS service they're implementing, just to get more tries.
And what about remote access, right? VPN portals, VDI, Citrix, and all those things. What about attackers targeting those remote access points?
Yeah. From what I've seen, majority of the time, I'll say those access points are well secured. So without a little, social engineering, those are harder to get to. However, those are cream of the crop. What people are looking for, exposed VMware Horizon clients are a huge thing that'll get targeted. So make sure that you're implementing MFA on those.
Yeah, for sure. So what would a typical password spray look like? Or I guess, what are some of the indicators of a password spray? Now we're going to get into detect and mitigate in a little bit, but kind of walk us through what that kind of looks like, maybe from a pen test side of things or an attack side of things.
So from my side of things, what does it look like?
Yeah.
Like my process for doing it?
Yeah.
So when I'm setting up, you want to talk about tools? Because I can go through specific tools and what the different ones look like.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, actually. Why don't you mention some of the tools you use, why you use them, how you use them, that kind of thing.
So shout out to Knapsack, because I've been using CredMaster as my primary tool since, I don't know, it's been a year and a half, but amazing tool. So it actually has different capabilities for different endpoints that you want to spray. Majority of them are Microsoft, but there's one where you can spray any endpoint. You just have to specify it. So it is an amazing tool. And the tool is implementing something called FireProx. And what that does is it rotates your IP per request. And you can tell it how many IPs you want to rotate through. So I do 5, but I think you can rotate up to 15 different IPs during a spray. So that tool in particular makes it a little bit tricky to detect a password spray. But
tell a little bit why that's an important part of this.
Yeah. So One of the reasons we use the tool in general is to give a better picture to defenders of what a real password spray is going to look like. Because majority of the times, unless you're dealing with, a script kiddie or something like that, that's just trying for easy creds, they're going to be rotating those IPs because they want to slide under the radar in terms of default Microsoft detections and preventions. And they also don't want to spring any alerts in case you have an MSSP or anything of that nature. So rotating those IPs and going low on the radar is extremely helpful.
Yeah, because Microsoft has something called Smart Lockout, and if it sees a number of failed login attempts from a specific IP address in a specific window, it will block those requests. It will prevent you from accessing that resource, right? So Smart Lockout is something that Microsoft has. It's in Entra Azure to help mitigate and prevent against those types of attacks. So by rotating the password, we're authenticating from a different source each time, and we get to rotate through. And there are indicators in that as well that we can talk about at the end. But that is one reason why, is if security vendors are getting smart, they're kind of figuring out that if all of these login requests come from a single IP, we block the IP and we're good to go, right? So we use Fireprox, which is a tool to proxy those requests from different source IP addresses. And it's cool. It spins up an EC2 instance, right, for each region, and kind of like proxies the requests through there. So it's a really neat tool. CredMaster is really cool.
Yeah, and that entire instance, I don't know how many password spray we run a month. It's it's a pretty high number, but I think I pay like 50 cents a month for that service. So Fireprox is super efficient and it is super good. So,
yep, awesome. So I interrupted you about the kind of process you go to. You use CredMaster, and how does that look like from there?
Yeah, so CredMaster I'm using after I've done OSINT. So that's going to be day 2, regardless of the organization. Typically, I like to start either end of the day 1, or start of the day 2. And the reason for that is I want to let my tools run and gather as many emails as possible so I can have a big of attack surface as possible. And then I'm taking that email list, specifying my endpoint that I want to spray against, and then kicking off a spray. And that spray runs with that password list, part of which I make during that day, and then part of which I already have built out. And then that spray runs until the end of the engagement.
Nice. And so that's running for 3 days, 4 days sometimes, or even longer, of trying one password per hour, essentially, right?
Right. That's correct.
So, we can try, depending on how long it is, 36, 72 passwords, depending how long the engagement is, we're going to be able to try a lot of passwords. And that's part of the benefit, of doing that is trying a lot of different passwords, seeing if there are weak passwords being used.
Yep. So double-edged sword. 1, it's testing for initial access for us, and then 2, it's testing password policies and implementations on the defender side.
So the last question before we move on to kind of the internal side of things is, let's say you get a password, right? You get a valid login or a successful login. What happens at that point?
During the pen test, I take my list of hosts and I label them based on what they are. So I make a section for login pages, and then I highlight, high value assets, resources that I've noted. So I'm taking that password. First thing I'm doing, I'm putting it in Mail Sniper or MFA sweep, and I'm testing for all the different endpoints that might be lacking MFA. After that, then I'm going through all those third-party resources that may not have the same MFA implementation, and I'm testing it there as well.
Yep. Yeah, because like you said, the purpose of password spraying is to get a valid account, to get initial access to an organization, whether that's an M365 account or initial access into a internal network, which we'll talk about next, or whatever the case may be. Attackers want those credentials. They like those credentials. Credentials are sold on the internet every day. Credentials are stolen from data breaches, right? So there's a lot of places we can get credentials from, including guessing. And those are just constantly bombarded and sprayed across the internet, to pretty much everything with a login page. I think it's funny because I set up a lab, I don't know, it was last year, set up an Exchange lab, put it on the internet for working on some CredMaster development.
Minutes. Yep.
Yeah, it was up for like 5 minutes, and I already started seeing bots and mass spraying attempts against my Exchange OA login that I had on the internet. So it happens very quickly, and it's happening every minute of every day if you have something on the internet. So anything we missed on the external portion of password spraying? Anything you wanted to mention?
I think we covered everything outside of spraying SaaS services, in addition to Microsoft services. So I use different tools for those. Sometimes I write my own spray tools to use per engagement. In addition, Burp Suite is also a very good spot that I use. Those sprays are a little bit easier to detect though, because they're not as fine-tuned and they all come from the same IP. However, you don't see logging of the same capability on services that companies don't own or are managed by somebody else. So that is very helpful in, helping to fly under the radar when you do those sprays.
Yeah, and we mentioned password spraying specifically, right? Trying one password against a number of accounts and then trying another one against those same accounts is different from if there was FTP or SSH or some other service listening on the external network. We would still try to log into those, but it's a different attack, and that's a brute force attack, or credential stuffing, something like that, where it's a little bit different, kind of the same idea, but a little different. So maybe we'll go into another episode,
we can do a separate episode on that,
about brute forcing those different services and how to test those different services externally and what that looks like. But switching over to the internal pen testing side of things. So a lot of times when I get access to an internal environment, right? Password spraying is not one of the first things I do. I will first look for credentials. So I'll go to the file shares, I'll look in logon scripts, I will look locally on the endpoints, I'll try to find credentials, and then when I do find credentials on the network, I will use those to password spray. So it's kind of a more opportunistic type of thing on the internal side of things, is I first want to find what looks to be a valid credential and then use that credential and spray that across the environment to see if any other accounts are using that password.
Yeah, I think another thing you do that's also very similar to the external process is you do look for those, set up documentation for new users, and you also grab those passwords and spray them internally.
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite techniques, I guess, is looking through SharePoint, OneDrive, and file shares for a new user setup guide or new employee guide or XYZ form, right? That has the default password. And I will spray that across the environment. And usually in large environments, talking 1,000 or more users, you'll probably get at least one or two, just statistically speaking. So the larger the environment, the more often I see that and see those credentials being valid. But it happens in small environments too, where there's an MSP that sets up the accounts and they're kind of outsourced IT. But I do see that quite a bit. Another aspect of the internal password spraying technique is many times we will get password hashes during an internal engagement, whether that's through poisoning in something like LMNR, and we can poison those requests using LMNR and get a hash. We can sometimes crack those hashes if the passwords are weak. And a lot of times, if I do crack a password, I will also try and spray that plain text password. So, perfect example, like I said, I run Responder or Invade, which is a common man-in-the-middle attack tool for pen testing. I will get 10, 12 hashes. I will crack like 3 of them, and it'll be some password that looks like it might be generic, right? Not a randomly generated password. I will then spray those passwords in the environment to see if any other accounts are using those. Same thing with Kerber roasting. So Kerber roasting is when you can get a password hash from a service account. So if the service account is using a weak password and I'm able to crack it, I will also spray those passwords. And then, just guessing, right? Guessing company name, same thing you do on external. Company name, year, exclamation mark. or some geographic landmark or demographic information about users. I will also guess, if I have some information that I find, what those passwords are. Fortunately or unfortunately, I guess, oftentimes I don't really need to guess because I find so many credentials in password.txt and .doc documents that I don't really need to guess. But that is one aspect of our internal pen test process.
So tell me from a time standpoint in your process. I know that I do, one of my main goals is to start it as soon as possible. How does yours differ in that way, timing wise, when you spray?
Yeah, mine differs in that I don't run a consistent password spray throughout the lifetime of the engagement like we do on externals. So mine is more opportunistic, I would say. So if I do find a new user setup document, if I find a local admin password, if I find some other password that looks like it might be a generic password, it's more opportunistic, and then I'll spray them then. I'm not necessarily trying to be stealthy in any way, because that's not really my goal for password spraying. Password spraying is pretty trivial to detect if you have the appropriate logging set up. So mine's more about figuring out, what is the impact? Is this credential actually being used anywhere? So I will usually, if I have a lot of passwords that I have documented that I want to try, I usually do 1 an hour. I will reference the password policy beforehand, but usually no more than one an hour, just like we do on the external. Another thing that I'll do when password spraying, or why I would password spray, is breach credentials. So looking at things like, data breaches and credentials from Dehashed in other services online. You can get previously owned passwords or breached passwords from data breaches, and you can try those as well. A couple of the tools I like to use, honestly, my preferred method is just PowerShell. I've got a script that I wrote and customized that I like to use because I'm a big PowerShell fan. But there are a number of other tools that many pen testers, if you're listening, probably prefer or like. One of those, CrackMap Exec, previously or now called NetExec. It's under new ownership, I guess, of open source. Ownership is a thing. But there are a number of other tools that you can use for that. But my kind of go-to is PowerShell. I've written a PowerShell script that will spray all the accounts that are enabled that are not within one lockout, and it will exclude certain accounts if you want. So usually what I do is I exclude a couple of the admin accounts that I know can unlock accounts in case I happen to lock something out. And that's kind of my preferred method.
Yeah, you've got a very efficient, well built out PowerShell script for that. I mean, you call it a script. I might give it the name tool at this point. I feel like you fleshed it out pretty well.
Yeah, it's funny because everything I make is like, yeah, it's just a PowerShell script, but like it ends up being, hundreds of lines of
it's
code.
Like 300 line long. It's a complete tool. Once you put the ASCII art on it, you can't call it a script anymore. At that point, it's a tool. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and if you have formatted output, it's no longer a script, right? It's a tool.
True.
Yeah. So that's kind of when and why and how I would pen test internally. So let's talk about detections, mitigations. Let's hear, what do you think? What are kind of like your top couple mitigations for password spraying?
Specifically for externals, since the primary resource that we're spraying against is, Microsoft environment, I would say implementing, using Entra to implement banned passwords that users can't use and constantly updating that list. Maybe even pulling an ingest list in, just of those common months, year, exclamation point, special character, making sure all those are banned. In addition to that, month, year, exclamation point, those as well. Since those are such common passwords, just implementing a policy that says, "Hey, sorry, can't have that." That's a huge one for me.
Yeah, and Microsoft Entra password protection, I think, is what they call it now. They changed the name of Microsoft or of Azure AD, just recently, and they're probably going to change it again in the future.
I don't know why. I like Azure.
Yeah, Microsoft Entra password protection. It has a built-in list of known weak and breach passwords. You can also, like Tyler said, add your own. So adding company name and company specific language or words to those banned passwords list is a good idea. So if you see users are using some sort of company specific thing, put that in your banned password list.
Right. I would say that'll help to mitigate majority of the attacks that you're going to see externally. Since, if people are password spraying, they're not going to do password sprays that are, going to take them a while. Usually if they're password spraying, it's because they're looking for a quick and easy target, and then they'll move on to the next organization to check for weak passwords. So, taking those completely out of the ballpark in general is, that puts a good block up.
Yeah. And, probably the biggest after that, or maybe even before that, I guess, is MFA in conditional access, right? If we're talking about the Entra world. MFA is just a no-brainer, right? It should be essentially everywhere, anywhere of importance, right? Because it's only a matter of time before a user uses the same password on Facebook as they do for their company email, and their Facebook account gets hacked, or Facebook itself gets hacked, or Meta, or whatever the breach is, right? In their reusing passwords. We see that time and time again. We'll get a password from a breach password list. We'll spray it against an environment, and we'll get one or two of those. So MFA is a good preventative tool for that. It's not perfect, right? We saw that in this year and last year with prompt bombing attacks and social engineering. It's not perfect, but it's another layer, right? It's another layer of defense that you add in. And same with conditional access. Tyler, is like, if users are only supposed to be logging in, if you have no remote users and they're only logging in from the office, conditional access is great. There's a number of other interesting things you can do with conditional access. If Darius was here, he'd have a whole long
He'd
list
have a slew
of,
yep.
He'd be able to rattle off 17 different conditional access policies you can implement. So conditional access is great for Entra. Same with MFA, banned password lists.
Geofencing is another one that could fit in with that category.
Yeah, definitely. Geofencing. So what's a good point is, if you don't have any users in China or Russia or any other countries, right? You can restrict those countries, right, from authenticating completely. You can do it with your firewall. You can do it with conditional access. So really good ways to kind of prevent and mitigate those things. And that kind of goes along the lines of detecting, right? If you have a SOC or an MSP or something like that, they can look at those failed logins and say, oh, this login is coming from, Indonesia, and 10 minutes earlier they were logging in from, California. That seems weird. We should probably, flag that and do some additional analysis, or just block it depending on company policy and what the users typically do. For the internal side of things, I kind of echo the same thing, right? Strong password policy, making sure that you have, or you're technically forcing users to use a strong password, and kind of administratively enforcing it as well. But also something that I don't see used often enough is fine-grained password policies. So fine-grained password policies is a thing you can implement within Active Directory, and you can specify certain password policies or a specific password policy for specific OUs or specific users. And what's great about that is you can have a service accounts OU, and you can specify a fine-grained password policy that says, hey, all these passwords have to be 30 characters, they have to have complexity, all the same password requirements you'd have on the other password policies, but you can make those a little bit stronger for your service accounts. And that's a great way to utilize a feature that's built into Active Directory to harden your accounts and harden your passwords.
I feel like one thing we didn't touch on was just user education.
Yep.
I feel like that's a big one. Just educating users on bad passwords. Even educating users on things that are becoming more common, such as passphrases, to become more secure and have those longer, more complex passwords. Like everything else, users are going to be your point of fault. So just educating them and making them more aware on the different attacks that are used and the ways that they can protect themselves and your organization is always best policy.
Yeah, and on top of that, if you are using password managers, password vaults, and you're allowing users to use them, or maybe you're deploying them for users to use, making sure they know how to use those password managers correctly, right, and securely. I think there was a couple password vaults that got breached. Oh no, it's just LastPass. That's right. This past year, and if you have a weak master password, things could be pretty bad. So just as like you said, educating users how to use the technology that you have and how to work within the context of your company's processes for passwords and password management and where to store them, right? Which is not on file shares. It's not in document management systems. It's not in SharePoint or OneDrive or anything like that. Good password storage goes a long way. So detect, we didn't really touch on detect all that much. So maybe Tyler, you want to tackle some of the ways to detect password spraying?
Yep, my password sprays in particular for the external. Since we are rotating the IPs, there's some other things that you can look out for. One of the biggest things I tell clients to look for is user agent. Since the spray is all coming from the same user agent, that's a good way to correlate which logs are coming from the same source or not. In addition to that, it will be the sprays I do are categorized as risky sign-ins. So you can check all this in Entra under those sign-in attempts and check the different, fields, and they'll all be listed as risky sign-ins just because of the way that they're sent. In addition to that, all of them are going to have that same user agent. So that's a good way to detect that when those IPs are rotating.
Yeah, and on the internal, the biggest way is getting those DC logs and looking for failed logins within a very short period of time from the same source. So source host, source IP, those will all be the same. I don't do anything fancy or creative with my password sprays. Like I said, the intent of mine is just to see if there are passwords that are valid. It's not necessarily to be stealthy during a pen test. We're not super focused on stealth during a pen test. So number of failed logins, short period of time from the same host. You can also look at, if all of your accounts are getting locked out, it's kind of an obvious sign that something bad is going on. Might be intentional, might be unintentional. But also another one, just applicable to external too, is if you start seeing password sprays for accounts that don't exist, right? When I was talking about that story where I set up the Exchange lab on the internet, they were trying like admin and administrator and admin123 and all the different sorts of usernames that didn't exist in my environment because I just set it up. So looking at things like that can be an indicator as well.
And the last thing, I'll mention it for you, is honeypot accounts would be a great way to detect password sprays. Accounts that should not be having authentication attempts to them or just dummy accounts that are there. That's another good way to detect both internal and externally.
Yeah, that's such a good one and so underestimated, right? Something I've seen organizations do is they'll set up like a fake executive on LinkedIn with a fake email. And then anytime that email gets an email sent to it or an authentication attempt to it, they block the email, block the IP address, they go in the full nuke mode on that origination or the source of that activity. So yeah, that's super good and a great way to detect that early on. Awesome. So I think that's it. Is there anything else you want to say? Is that anything else you want to mention?
I think we got it. I think we covered it. What about you? Final thoughts?
No, that's it. I appreciate everybody. I appreciate your time listening to this episode. Hopefully it was informative to you or educational and you got something out of it. If you enjoyed our episode, if you enjoyed our content in the podcast and the stuff we're doing, you can follow us on offsec.blog. And if you want to work with us, if you need a pen test or anything like that, you can go to secureIT360.com and check us out there. And we release new episodes every Wednesday, and we have a lot of fun stuff planned for this year for content as a whole. So I'm really looking forward to it. Looking forward to sharing more content with you all, and we appreciate it. And we will see you all next Wednesday.